In this video, I'm going to show you how I created this Star Wars poster in Photoshop. This is 74 layers. It's almost 3 gigabytes in size. Took about 20 hours to create, and I'm going to take you through everything from the composition, the photography of the pieces here, all the techniques and effects I used to bring this together in Photoshop and work up to this final piece. So stick around, you're going to learn a lot from this. See you soon. Okay, so the way I always start shots like this is with a plan. And before we get into all the Photoshop stuff and all the various layers here and what I've done, which I know is the bit you're interested in, I want to kind of talk about the inspiration of where this comes from, because it's really, really important to understand that process and that workflow so that you can think about that if you're trying to attempt a piece like this. So for this piece, I was really, really heavily inspired by this piece of art, which is actually from a game in the Witcher series called The Thronebreaker Tales, I believe. Now, I love this piece of art. There's a few things going on here that make this really, really clever. So obviously it's a montage. You've got all these different characters in different sizes, and you can see there's completely different settings here. There's Geralt here and this sort of queen character that look like they're more placed over here in the mountains with the dragon and have this sort of red sunlight coming across their faces. And then you've got these characters over here that look like they're a little bit more evil. And then you've got this sort of volcano and these dark clouds and this monster down here. And clearly it's darker, it's nighttime, but there's this lava or fire which is casting a different kind of red light on these characters. Beneath all these, you have this blend of the smaller characters that then sort of centralize to this throne area, which has a very, very cool light around it. There's none of the sort of red tones that you see on the top tier of characters. And the thing I especially love is, although these are sort of 3 different scenes in the one montage, the artist has done this really, really clever thing where the shadow of the queen figure here kind of goes across the face of this character to her right. So it provides a sort of continuity through the lighting that carries through from the left part of the montage to the right. So I was really, really heavily inspired by this, and I kind of wanted to steal the composition here and apply it to a Star Wars setting. And so flipping back to my work, you can kind of see how I've done that and where that inspiration's taken hold. It's really tricky to figure out these composites, because what I did was look at that Witcher picture and go, right, well, I'm effectively going to replace the characters in the Witcher composition with the Star Wars one. So what a logical grouping. So Luke and Obi-Wan kind of make sense to go together, and then we can place them on Tatooine with the twin sons. And then equally, Luke and Leia go together as brother and sister, as the sort of central family unit of Star Wars. And then Darth Vader obviously has a strong relationship with Leia, even though you don't know he's her father in episode 1. They have scenes together. And so that bleeds over to a lot of the time in the film Leia spends in space. Hence, Darth Vader and the Death Star on this right side. And then you can see I'm doing a similar thing down the bottom of bringing together other sets or scenes of characters, R2 and C-3PO, Han and Chewbacca and Tarkin there, and some spaceships and the Death Star gunner over on the right. So this is tricky, and it's a case of moving the characters around until you find a place where it all works together. So one thing I copied quite liberally was that shadowing effect. So you can see the shadow off the back of Luke's head is just slightly obscuring Leia's face. And then I've got that same kind of red rim lighting going on, which you can effectively think is coming from Vader's saber. And so there's sort of red lights around the rim of her. What I'm really happy about is this photo of Leia looks very, very close to how she's lit right at the start of the film on the Tantive 4 on the blockade runner when she's hiding from the stormtroopers. So in terms of a final result, I'm really happy with it. I'm really happy with what happened with the composition. So now we'll go from the beginning and I'll talk about how I pulled this all together. While we're talking about the composition of the piece, you might be interested in this blog article I wrote over on my website, which contains a full write-up of how I created this piece, along with some more information about how I work with the composition from that Witcher piece, some other things I did with planning. You can see there's some info around the lighting, all sorts of stuff around the photography. So you may like to go over and check that out. There's a link below in the description here on YouTube, or just head over to ToyShooter.com and you'll find this piece over on the site. So the first thing I do when I start out is I make a rough sketch of what I think the final piece is going to look like. Just a really scrappy drawing on paper of what characters I want and where they're going to be. As I'm doing this, I'm thinking about how I want to pose them, how I want the lighting to flow across the piece. And that gives me a rough guideline for how I can then go and take photos. So normally I do green screen, but for this one I got a little bit lazy and I just shot a lot of the pieces against black, which was a mistake because it's much, much harder to extract photos or characters from a black background than it is from green. But it's not impossible, it's just a little bit harder to do than green. So you can see here, very, very simple shot of R2-D2 and C-3PO together. R2's the Hot Toys model. C-3PO is an older sideshow piece. Then I've got the older Luke Skywalker. You can see here I'm starting to think about the lighting. So I've lit him from the left with a bright key light to mimic that sun that I'm going to have coming in from the left of the piece. And then I've got red lighting coming in from the right to place him in the picture where that red lighting source will be coming from on the right. Leia was much more intricate with the lighting. This was a little bit of work to set up because you can see here I've done some pretty precise work with the lighting to create this shadow across her face. So there's still light catching her. Her face is still lit up, but she's got this shadow just cutting across her face. And then I've also lit her from behind. So she's got this sort of beautiful haloing effect coming through her hood there. And just like with Luke, I've also got a red light at the side just kicking in, which is just bringing in a little bit of red on the side of her face as well. And I think she turned out really, really great. So very, very happy with how this photo came through. Kenobi, very, very easy shot. Pretty much the same setup as Luke, just dropping him in with the same light setup. Tarkin there, again, is going to have a little bit of that red light coming across and lighting him up. Kind of wish I'd done a little bit more. Not that it really matters, because whenever I'm doing these composites, it's not too important about getting the lighting right in the shot, because you can always fix that in Photoshop. And with these compositions, it doesn't really matter. No one's going to be able to tell that you've introduced some sort of fake color in the lighting in Photoshop. Moving on, simple shot of the probe droid, the torture droid there from the Death Star, and then Vader here. So for Vader, I took two shots. Took a very simple shot with him just lit with a couple of lights here, and then I took a shot that was pretty much just his lightsaber. So this piece from Hot Toys, the lightsaber actually lights up. So this was a really, really long exposure. I forget how long. How do you get it on screen? Can't quite tell. But anyway, really, really long exposure of the saber to create a lot of red light around him. And so I composited these two photos together to get that kind of red glow lighting him up, as well as the, I guess, more pleasing white lighting on him. Then we've got Han and Chewie, pretty simple lighting setups on them. And then I went back for a second round of shots where I did actually use a green screen. So I've got the Death Star gunner here on green, and this piece of Death Star wall, which is made by GTP Galactic Trading Post Toys, that do these wonderful little pieces that are for smaller Black Series 6-inch figures. But I just pretty much wanted the pattern, and we'll see why in a second when we go back to the composite. This is the Bandai, what's it called? Perfect grade Falcon. So this is still in progress. You can see I've built this model. I've got a lot of the decals on, but I haven't done any weathering to it. And there's a lot of paintwork that still needs to be done, but I didn't care. I knew it would be okay to use in the shot. So very quick, simple shot of this. And then another Bandai shot of a smaller Star Destroyer model. This is actually placed on a piece of glass and shot from beneath. You can see there's a reflection in the glass. Really, I should have had a polarizer on the lens, but again, I wasn't too worried because I knew I'd be able to knock that reflection out in Photoshop. And then another Bandai model of the Blockade Runner, similar treatment, and again, I knocked that reflection out in Photoshop. Finally, this is a weather vane or moisture evaporator that Hasbro made many years ago for the smaller figures that I wanted to get a shot of to place in the desert, just to sell that sort of Tatooine look and feel. So those are all the shots I took. Then I took all these into Photoshop and extracted them. I'm not going to cover how to do that in this video. I've got another video on the channel which covers how I do extraction, so make sure you seek that out. Next, we're going to jump into the Photoshop composition and talk about how I get these set up in the final Photoshop document and start working on them. So here's the final thing in Photoshop, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to peel back the layers and show you each part of this composition so you can get an idea of how I've built this up. But it's useful to start with actually the finished piece, because then I can deconstruct it and show you how this all comes together, rather than you having to literally sit through 10 to 20 hours of me working on this to get to this final piece. So one thing I always do at the start of these compositions is establish what I call a control folder, and it's always at the top. So there's two things I pretty much always have in here. One is a black and white layer, and the other is a compositional guide. So let me show you what these are. So with a black and white layer, I can see what the photo looks like in black and white, and this is really important because when you work on composites like this, the colors can really throw you off, and especially when you're working with extracted photos that often don't look that great to begin with. They might have fringing problems, and you might want to do a lot of work to integrate the various characters with smoke and effects and sort of color washes. And so it's very hard to get a sense of what the final piece is going to look like while you're kind of dealing with those issues and figuring out how you're going to integrate things. So I love to have a black and white layer always on the top, because I can turn this on and see what the piece looks like in black and white. Because if it doesn't work in black and white, it's not going to work in color. The other important thing with a black and white layer is it shows you the contrast. So it shows you where the highest areas of contrast are in the piece and where the lower areas of contrast are. So immediately when you look at this, you can see there's pretty high levels of contrast around a lot of the faces. So Luke's face, Leia's face, Vader obviously is always going to be high contrast because of him being black and shiny. He's going to pick up the lights and make them, the opposite end of the spectrum, very bright. And equally around the droids, Tarkin, Han and Solo, these are all catching your eye. And that's done deliberately. All throughout this composition, when you look at some of the work I've done throughout this, all of this is done on purpose to draw the composition, draw your eyes to these areas in the composition where you want to be able to focus on the characters and their faces. Conversely, if you look at other areas like the Falcon here, the desert, the weather vanes, these are very low contrast. So they're washed out, desaturated to an extent, not that you can tell that with black and white, but the idea is they don't get in the way of the characters. They're secondary. So this is why I like a black and white layer, because it enables you to fix issues like that without worrying about the color. Second thing I've got in there is a radial fan, what I'm calling it. So for me, this is the compositional guide for this piece. And I guess the idea with this was I wanted to align parts of the composition with this fan. So a central point here is pretty much this guide for where I want things coming out. So you can see how that plays with the placement of things like Leia's gun is perfectly in line with that fan. Same as Vader's saber. Same as the line through the ships here, and to an extent some of the other places around the composite as well. But it was really, really important to get it right for the gun here and the saber there, so that you can just get a sense that there's a sort of fan-like effect coming out from the center of the picture here. So when I turn that off, it's kind of obvious that that's now happening. So as a control folder, this is really, really useful to, I guess, keep the work grounded as I then go through and start to work on the piece. So the next thing I'm going to show you is the color grade folder. So if I turn this off, you'll see how radically different this looks like. And this is a strange thing to start with, but as you can see, this makes a huge difference to the final piece. So effectively, without that, these are pretty much the raw photos. So the same photos you just saw in Lightroom are what you're looking at here, cut out, placed on the document, and then there are plenty of effects between each layer that do different things to these photos in certain places. But it's not until we bring this grading layer in that things start to get really, really different. So there's a number of things going on in here which I'm going to talk you through. So first, right at the bottom, there's a couple of small tweaks I've made to some of the star effects. And you can see those just around Vader's head there. If I turn them on and off, that's pretty much just bringing in a few more stars, a little bit more focused, twinkly little bits around, I guess, highlighted areas of the piece. And then lens flares. So there's a couple of areas where I've put lens flares here. Where that backlight is behind Leia, I've put one there in the center. And then I've also got one coming in from the left where the suns are. And in fact, I think I put them directly on the sun to give off the effect of that binary sunset from Tatooine. And you can see that coming across these sort of circles that have lit up Luke to an extent. I faded these out just manually with a brush, just to raise some of them. You can see the fill there is 45%, and the blending mode for the layers color dodge, just to make those work in a little bit more subtly. Then I've got the first layer of color grading. So right at the bottom, if you look across the bottom section of the picture here, I've got this kind of purple hue going all the way from the bottom through the top. And so everything from the bottom upwards is getting this sort of purpley blue hue all the way across it. And you can see that makes a huge difference. Then I've got a couple of layers of lookup tables, which are applying different color gradings. And then finally another tweak to that purple hue on the top, just to put a little bit more saturation around the bottom and make C-3PO and R2 a little bit more interesting, and same with Tarkin. And then finally, the last folder within this grading folder is dodge and burn. And I do this on every single piece. So this is going across the whole piece and just accentuating the highlights and accentuating the shadows. So if I turn that off, you can see the difference. So all of that makes up my grading work. This is something I will start work on as soon as I start work on the piece. So with the exception of dodge and burn, which I would always leave till last, pretty much everything in here I would be tweaking with, aware of, as I start to work on the piece. And it's often useful to establish the grading quite early on because it helps unify the colors and what the final piece is going to look like early, even when the individual pieces, individual cutouts are quite rough. You can use this to kind of give yourself a sense of where your whole piece is going to end up looking like. So that's the grade. So now we've gone through the grade. What I've done is I've turned off every single layer so we can go all the way to the bottom and start working through these and show you what each of them do. All I've done is actually left the color grade on right at the top, so you can kind of see what these things are going to look like when they're part of the final piece. There's a couple of things in there I've turned off, like the lens flares and the dodge and burn, which wouldn't make sense to leave on. But now we can go all the way back to the beginning and see how this piece started. So the first thing I did was bring in this star field. Now, for the life of me, I can't remember where I got this. I think it was stock footage, but suffice to say, it's pretty easy to do a Google search or go to a website like Unsplash, search for a star field, and you can get an image like this. So you can see I've popped that on, put it in screen mode to knock out the black, and then there's a layer mask there just to kind of control where the star field is going to appear, because obviously I want to fade it out across the left of the screen into the desert and desert sky of Tatooine as I build that up as we get further up in the piece. Moving on from that, we then get onto that desert, which is in this folder for Binary Sunset. So if we turn all these off and move over to the left, you can see that starts with this photo of a sunset here. This, I believe, was actually a screenshot from The Force Awakens, which is on screen for a very short amount of time, when I think some people are walking into the desert early on in Jakku. So I've grabbed that and I've colorized it and blurred it, so it's pretty obscure. Adding on to that, I've got this shot of a desert here, which again I've colorized a little bit, and then I put a curves adjustment on that just to darken it and integrate it with the lighting tones of the sky there. And then these clouds, which is a bit of an Easter egg because I used this shot in loads and loads of my pieces. So if you have an eagle eye and you look across a lot of the pieces I do, you'll see this same photo used again and again and again. It's a great photo, and for clouds, you pretty much can't tell based on the way I work with it. Then I'm starting to bring in some effects of the sun. So very, very simple little bit of painting with some orangey yellow here to start bringing in the idea of the sun being in the center there. And then I start to build up some sunspots, just painting on with a soft brush. Wasn't quite happy with the color of that alternative sun, couldn't quite get that right, so I just went with them both being bright. Lightened up the second one a bit, and then obviously those lens flares that I put on right at the end really make these shine, forgive the pun. And then finally I just desaturate the whole thing because it's a little bit too bright, and so that's just nicely starting to fade back now and will work as a good backdrop along with the star field there for the rest of the piece. Finally, I'll just touch on the moisture evaporators. You saw those small pictures of the Hasbro pieces there. So I've just put a couple of those in. I won't go through all the layers here. Suffice to say, this is about darkening them so they're not as prominent on the screen. And then in the case of this one, there's a smart blur on it just to put it out of focus. And that's pretty much all there is to the backdrop. Next up, we're bringing in the Death Star here over on the right. I think I grabbed this straight off StarWars.com somewhere. It certainly took me a bit of Googling to find a high-res picture of the Death Star, but there it is. Pop that over on the right. Just knock the fill down so it wasn't quite as bright. It was a little bit too prominent, up at 100%. So just toning that back. And obviously these are the kind of adjustments I would have made with all the characters on top so that they don't steal the attention. And then you can see the Death Star gunner gets placed in here as well. Vader is next. He comes here. So there's a few layers to Vader. We knock those out. Put a bit of shadowing behind his head. That's pretty much just to separate him from the background there. And then we've got a few of these God rays. So the way I do this is with the radial blur effect here in Photoshop. So it's a case of making a bunch of light spots, which I essentially get from the light areas of the image. Then I got to filter, blur, and radial blur, and change this to zoom. It takes a bit of playing around with because you have to drag the center of the zoom area here. And then once you've set it, you want to make sure you don't move it for your entire document. Then I'll typically apply this a couple of times, and then you get these kind of God rays or sort of fan out effects across the piece. Next, just applying a bit of colorization to those God rays so they go a little bit red just to create a bit of contrast. And then finally, the effects around Vader's saber, which is dead easy. It's just drawing out a white core and then a combination of both an outer glow for the bigger red glow and a drop shadow to give a slightly finer one around the center. And that's Vader done. Next up, we've got the Falcon over on the left against the desert. A little bit of shadow there before we bring the Falcon in. And you can see right away it's too bright, it's too contrasty. So a bunch of things going on here to just tone down the Falcon and integrate it better with the background. So firstly, a little bit of a color match. This is more to bring it in line with the characters in the foreground rather than the background. Darken it up a bit, desaturate it a bit, and then this is just a little bit of shadow that is going to apply behind Luke, Han, and Chewie that are going to be in front of it. Moving further on, we've got this God ray around Leia, which is a little out of place, but exactly the same effect that I did around Vader that you saw before. And now we get Leia in the piece. So you can see pretty easy. She's already looking good. I've done a little bit of work around her with the masking there. If I just turn the Leia mask off, or rather look at it, you can see how I've kind of worked with that, painted on it, just to integrate her into the composite. And then Obi-Wan coming in over on the left. Same again with his Leia mask. Just knocking out various parts of him to integrate him in the piece. And this is where we get the first kind of alteration of some of the lighting. So a simple curves adjustment here, where I just tone down the contrast on his right side. The reason I do that is so when I bring Luke in, you're focused more on Luke's silhouette than you are on Obi-Wan. And then on beneath Luke, there's a layer there which just darkens around him to separate him from both Obi-Wan and Leia. Finally, the red light that I'd got in the photography wasn't quite enough for my liking, so I've added a layer here that just turns his sort of highlights even more red using this quick adjustment layer. Moving down to the right, we've got this folder that contains all the work for Tarkin. So the first thing I bring in is this space wall that you saw me take the photo of. And with this, what I'm doing is putting it in screen mode. So you just see that very sort of famous outline of the lit walls from the Death Star. Did a bit of work with contrast on this just to force the sort of gray straight to black. and then bring the light panels up to white. So I can then put that in screen mode, which leaves the white and knocks out the black. And that just forms this great sort of backdrop for bringing Tarkin in. Duplicated that layer and blurred it. And then we bring in the torture droid here, just behind Tarkin. And there he is, sat on his throne. So this is a great effect. It's very, very reminiscent of the scene early on in the film where he sat around the table with Vader and the other Imperial officers. And then finally, we add that same God Ray effect around him. And this looks really, really great. Moving left of Tarkin, we've got Chewie and Han brought in separately, but you wouldn't know that. They look like they're together. And that's mainly to do with them both being lit with the same lighting setup. And then we bring in the droids, C-3PO and R2-D2 in the middle. This was one shot, but I had to do a little bit of work with a Leia mask there just to obscure the bottom part. And then I put in this kind of smoky separation between them and Luke, and then another layer of separation behind that to just darken it and nestle them into his, I guess, arm shadow, if you like. And then finally, I just add another layer with another lens flare for R2's light there at the front. Back over to the right of Tarkin, we're going to bring in the two ships here. The Star Destroyer chasing down the blockade runner here. So these obviously look great, but a little bit of work required just to make these sit in the piece a bit better because they're a little bit too bright, hogging the focus a bit. So first of all, just darkening off the Star Destroyer so it's clear that it is behind the blockade runner. And then the same kind of God Ray effects that are sort of coming out of Vader and Tarkin we'll put behind both of these. A little bit of shadow just to darken off between the Star Destroyer and that Death Star gunner there. A little bit more further darkening on the Star Destroyer. And finally, just a little bit of color correction to put a bit of red back in these two to make them stand out a little bit from the blue background. So that's pretty much it. There's the final piece. There's those star tweaks in there, and then the final layers that I turned off at the beginning, the lens flare, the purple haze and the dodge and burn, and you have the final piece. It's worth noting this composition was created to be really, really wide. I wanted to create something that I could use in certain places where I'd want a wider image on my website. So I built this very much in mind of that, so it extends all the way out with this kind of dead space with the desert here. But I've certainly published this with a couple of different formats where I kind of crop in and just focus on the central characters here. And it makes a really, really great piece, whatever format it's in. So I hope you like this video. I hope it was useful. I hope it gives you some ideas of how you can do your own compositions like this. If you've got any questions on this, please leave me a comment below. I'd love to help you out. So whatever it is you want to know, shoot me a comment below on YouTube and I will be sure to answer it. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Head to ToyShooter.com to join our newsletter and get my free guide to toy photography. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on YouTube using the link below. When you subscribe, look for this option to be notified whenever we upload new tutorials. Otherwise, videos will probably get lost in your feed here on YouTube. To see my work on Instagram, you can follow our account at instagram.com/WeShootToys, where you'll also find some exclusive behind-the-scenes videos. You can also get regular news and updates from our Facebook page at facebook.com/ToyShooter. As with YouTube, you can get notified whenever I upload news or photos by clicking on that like button arrow, then selecting all notifications. You can always change this later if I'm posting more cool stuff than you can handle. Here are all those links again. See you next time.